A lot of what we're talking about here is political corruption. It's just an ugly system.
There is so much that goes on behind closed doors. It is sneaky, and the public's not aware of that.
My first reaction was, there's no way that that's happening.
It's exploitative.
Just deceptive.
We're up against a very large political foe with incredible number of resources.
You know, what we're talking about here is people.
These people are trying to keep their own loved ones from being institutionalized.
The unions wanted to keep this quiet.
A lot of people are surprised when they find out it was Democrats and Republicans.
This is a national problem. This is multiple states. This is hundreds of millions of dollars.
This is wrong.
Family members who care for their sick loved ones using Medicaid are being charged dues for unions they're not members of.
The bulk of my daughter's care was really on me. Emotionally draining sometimes, very rewarding, but as she grew into an adult, it was actually quite scary to wonder what her future's going to be like.
This is one of my favorite pictures of her. She so enjoys every fall going to the pumpkin patch. We just take life one day at a time.
I tell Libby I have the best job in the world. I get to be Libby's mom. And it's hard work. It's a lot of work.
Home care is an important way of delivering services to those with disabilities. It avoids having to place them in an institution, a nursing home. Medicaid was built to function as a reimbursement program. Medicaid funds are required by statute to go directly to the provider of services to the client. And there are hundreds of thousands of these Medicaid compensated home caregivers around the country. Federal Medicaid law has always prohibited diversions of money to third parties that aren't providing services to Medicaid clients. But states and unions went ahead with it anyway.
It was impossible for any one person to see what had been done and what was going on. It began to crystallize for us when a lady walked into our office and told us something that seemed crazy. She said, I run a daycare, and some of the kids I watch get a little bit of a subsidy from the government so the parents can work and the kids can be in daycare. Somehow, I'm now a member of a union. This can't be right. And honestly, my first reaction was, there's no way that that's happening.
So a lot of these caregivers that I met were struck by the fact that they woke up one morning and they had no idea how they became a union member, that they were even paying dues, or that there was a union representing them. It was the oddest concept for them to come to terms with because they had no idea what all led up to those events.
Labor unions, primarily the Service Employees International Union, started looking at this arrangement. They saw the amount of money involved. This is hundreds of millions of dollars. And what SEIU tried to do to capture some of that Medicaid funds is it began persuading politically allied state governments that designated these home caregivers as public employees, state employees, if you will.
They decided if they can take compulsory fees from public employees, why not from anyone who receives public money? And the first group they targeted were these independent Medicaid providers.
First of all, these PCAs are in their personal homes or the homes of the loved ones, so they're not in a workplace. And second of all, do we really think that these personal care attendants are going to issue a labor dispute against the loved one they're taking care of?
"33 years ago, she was born with a disability. You don't go into this preparing for it. You certainly don't go into it inviting it. It just comes to you. You know, there was a lot of the process of grief, because you're grieving really for your expectation for your child. You're not grieving for your child, you're grieving for your expectations for that child. All the kinds of dreams that you have for your children had to be adjusted. I have a background in labor. I was a Teamster early on. I was a voluntary dues payer. You always wanted to make sure your local was a cohesive group with very similar interests. In this particular situation, SEIU formed one local of diversion groups by public vote. That's really strange. the representation is locked in and is dictated by a certain subgroup of the membership. The very core issue, right from the get-go, was the way that this local was formed. Not because of representational interests, but because of political and economic interests of the union. And so the very beginning of this was, in my estimation, poisoned.
When I signed up to be a caregiver, I didn't realize that I had to sign up to be a union member, and I didn't want to be. They say that without the union work that they do, we would not have the wages that we have. They wanted my money right out of the box. They were ready to go ahead and take 3% of my wages, which were very small to begin with, which were supposed to go towards my daughter's care. And then 3 months later, I found that they were taking 3%, despite the fact that I did not sign up. It felt even worse to know that they felt that I had owed them that money. And for the reasons being that they were going to get me more benefits, and in reality, the health benefits weren't even tied to union membership. So to me, that's just deceptive.
There were a lot of tricks. We had people who were showing up at the door trying to get us to sign new union cards without disclosing the fact that they'd hidden a restrictive opting out process within that card.
They are manipulative, and they will call, and they will knock on the doors, and they will try to, in some cases, even sign union cards for you.
I mean, we have copies of, we have pictures of a signed union card and one signature, and then the lady's real signature, showing how they don't match up at all.
You can get just a little bit angry. Excuse me, but these are resources that we need to enhance her life, and you're taking them for dubious representation.
Almost 10 years later, this just makes my blood boil. To imagine them sitting there thinking, here's all this government money, and if we take a few dollars from them, most of them won't even know, and the ones who do know won't be able to do a damn thing about it. You saw something called dues coming out of your subsidy check. There's nobody to call to say, what is this and how can I make it stop? It wasn't obvious how the unions were getting their hands on this money. Once we figured out how complicated the dues skim was, we actually had to draw a diagram so that we could understand it. And we thought, well, surely the unions didn't decide to just do this in Michigan. They must be doing it in other places too. We began talking to our counterparts in other states. They were beginning to pick up on what we had found in Michigan.
So dues skimming as a whole, it's theft. I mean, it's taking away money from people who need it the most. These people don't necessarily know that money's getting taken out of their pockets. They don't know about what the union is fighting for. They don't know where their union dues are being spent. So that becomes a really difficult fight to fight. It's an education fight. It's an understanding. And more importantly for these people, it's what can you actually do about it?
If SEIU dues comes out of X amount of dollars, we have X amount of dollars minus SEIU fees equals less money for Josh. Less funding for Josh. Less supports, less services for Josh.
So it all started with Pam Harris, and Pam just wanted somebody to go stand up for her. All she wanted to do was take care of her son, and there was nobody who was willing to stand in her corner.
When she found out that it was possible she was going to be forced to take some of that money and send it to the Service Employees International Union, she was outraged. She got out into the world, she started looking for an attorney, no one wanted to touch it, no one could understand it, and then she came to the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, and she found a friend. And she found someone who had the same amount of courage that she did to enter this fight.
The ABC7i team has learned of a legal fight pitting Governor Pat Quinn against families with loved ones who have disabilities.
5 years ago, Governor Quinn designated those home providers, including family members, as public employees, allowing a union to organize them, a union that backs the governor. It's now headed to the Supreme Court.
We filed a lawsuit saying it's unconstitutional to take money from these independent home care providers, transfer it over to the SEIU. And ultimately in 2014, we were successful. The Supreme Court held in Harris versus Quinn, it's unconstitutional for the government to take these individuals' money without their consent.
So what does that do for you with your ability to provide 24-hour care for your son?
What it does in essence is it says that we are not state employees, that the person we work for is the person with the disability. I work for my son Josh. He's the consumer. I cannot be compelled to unionize. I do not have to pay union dues.
Unfortunately, in 2014, the Obama administration passed a regulation to add an additional exemption found nowhere in the statute that arguably permits this kind of dues skimming.
Unions and their friends in government in several states found ways to actually subvert the Supreme Court ruling.
This, at the end of the day, is a fundamentally political issue.
With this new federal administration, we heard from them that they were interested in ideas. They were interested in things that can be done through the regulatory process in order to make changes.
All of a sudden, we have a chance to enforce the law as it was written back in the 1970s.
So our role was bringing these folks together, introducing them to the right people at Health and Human Services, folks in Congress when we were looking at maybe there's some opportunity to get legislation passed, and also to just bring a greater awareness of this issue.
The individual groups being able to work together is very important because we're very much fighting Goliath.
So being able to pull together the other state policy groups that were working on this same issue, just playing out in their state with different people, but largely the same unions and similar tactics, and being able to present all of this to the administration was huge. That was critical to build the case that this was a problem that deserved a federal solution.
Bringing actual personal care attendants, care providers to Washington to meet with people to explain their circumstances, because a personal story always goes farther than data and statistics.
This is something that can have huge impact. We can fight for individuals, a group of people who have no voice down in our state capitals, who have no voice in our nation's capital. You have an opportunity to shape the foundations of our country.
My trip to Washington, D.C. to meet some of the government officials who had not known about this practice was extremely rewarding. I took my daughter with me, and we got to explain our story to them.
You'd be surprised how many people at the federal level had no idea Medicaid dues skimming was happening or what it was. And we had to start from scratch to explain why it was bad, that it was illegal, and then try to persuade them to take action to put a stop to it.
So under the Federal Procedure Act, if an agency is thinking about promulgating a rule or a rule change, there are certain hoops that it has to jump through.
It had to go through something called the administrative rule process. What that means is the federal government posts something online, the Federal Registry, and says, we're going to change a federal rule.
There will be a time during which interested members of the public can submit written input to whatever that agency is, explaining why the proposed rule is a good idea or a bad idea. When they open this up for comments, what do you think is going to happen? Well, the government unions will start bombarding them with comments. Don't do this. Don't enact this rule. And so one of the things that we did was not only to comment ourselves, but to organize others, like individual personal care attendants, to submit comments on the proposed rule and explain why it was a good idea and why it should be done.
HHS repealed an Obama-era regulation that essentially gave the ability for these unions to trap providers into paying them. Now the due skim is effectively dead across the country.
This was an issue that impacted real people, and we were able to not only tell their stories, but bring those stories to Washington, D.C. Because the minute folks realize what is happening, that hard-working people, that these care providers are being taken advantage of, they fully understand that this is wrong.
The federal rulemaking process is complicated and difficult and arduous, and it took a lot of work by a number of policy organizations that collaborated to try to make this happen. So it took court action, it took executive action, it took legislative action for this to finally stop the due skim across the country.
Due skimming is illegal now and into the future.
It took an army of policy analysts to unravel the thing.
This is one of those issues where we needed the power of the movement. We needed multiple players from multiple states.
And in the end, it became a very powerful coalition that achieved a terrific result.
The sanitizing of sunlight is really important, and we can't get there unless people have the courage to stand up.
Why do we have to do this? It's because freedom is not self-executing. If people don't know that they have rights, if people don't know that the courts have sided with them, then the decision doesn't do them much good. People like us have to come alongside those who have been harmed by bad policy and help them.
I think it's awesome that there's people out there fighting for caregivers and for rights of people who don't have the knowledge that they should.
A lot of people want to reform government by changing Washington. This is a perfect example of showing that change doesn't start in Washington, but it ends there. Change starts in the states.
Most people in this world are looking for a way to gain significance. And there's some satisfaction when you find a way that's positive, that you actually do gain some significance.